Hi, I'm Dave, welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to take a closer look at the new Avant Slot Opel Manta 400. So you will have seen me unbox this car in the previous video. I did just want to go through it again and show you really quite close up how good the detail is on this model. Little brackets around the lights, very detailed. The lights themselves and the ones up on the wings. I like the attention to detail where they've put in the widened arches and they've put all the rivets in as well. A lovely interior, good cage, two drivers, nice detailing on the back as well, little tiny exhaust. And as I said before, overall the fit and finish is brilliant, and the wheels with the brake discs and the brake calipers inside them is another nice little detail. The paint itself is very smooth. I mean, to the point that you can barely feel any of the decals on there at all. It is a very, very high quality piece of kit. And as you can see, this car is labelled as driven by S. Asef. Now that is a man called Samir Asef. Now, in the UK, those of us of a certain age probably remember the Opel Manta in the hands of Tony Pond with the AC Delco livery, and probably more recognisably the Andrews livery, which was driven by legend Russell Brooks. Samir Asef drove one with this Marlboro livery on it. Here it is pictured in the rally from which this model is taken. Samir Asef was a Lebanese driver born in 1937. He lived up to the ripe old age of 82. Here he is during his racing career, and here he is, feet up, enjoying his retirement later in life. He's a very difficult man to find out much information about. His entire documented rally career seems to have been based around the Ivory Coast, which held a number of rallies, one of which was the famous Rallye Cote d'Ivoire, which was, for a short period, part of the World Rally Championship. Samir himself started racing in 1969 in, of all things, a Mercedes 260 SL. Through the 70s he drove a Peugeot 504 Ti and latterly the V6 Coupe version. Through the 80s he first drove Toyota Celicas and Corollas, the exceptions being in 1984 when he drove a Mitsubishi Lancer, and from mid-season 1985 through to mid-season 1987 when he drove the Opel Manta 400, which is the subject of this video. All in all, he drove a total of 15 World Rally events in the Ivory Coast. Between 1978 and 1992, his greatest achievement in international rallying was the 1986 World Rally Championship sanctioned Rallye Cote d'Ivoire, where he finished 5th overall. And this Avant Slot model is the model of that car that he drove in that rally. So, having looked at the top of the car and talked about the history of the car and the driver, let's look at the underneath. The first really obvious thing here is that this car is an angle winder, and the Mitsubishi Galant was an inline motor, but as you can see both chassis will take either pod, so I could, if I wanted to, experiment with both of these cars in both different configurations. The other interesting thing about this car is the Manta has very, very soft race tyres, whereas the Galant they're much firmer. It's also only two-wheel drive. Other than that, an awful lot of the underneath is very, very similar. There are two screws at the front and one at the back that hold the body on, and the pod has 4 screws in it and a pivot at the front, and you really only need to adjust the 2 screws at the rear for that. And there are holes, but not grub screws, to adjust the axle upwards, although I don't think you need to. And the guide has a spring under it. Now, I'll probably get rid of that later because, as I found with the previous Avant Slot, I didn't need it. So, looking at the bodies, the Manta is a much lighter weight in that it doesn't have the extra rear tray attached to it that the Galant does. The rest of it, very light interior, and very similar interior with the two drivers, one with the pace notes, and it doesn't rattle. So looking at the chassis, as you can see from the top, the motor sits in the pod on a bracket which is attached to the pod with 3 screws, and I think adjusting those screws will allow you to adjust the position of the motor a small amount, a millimetre or 2 here and there, just to give you some fine adjustment on the gear mesh. I think if you want bigger adjustment, because for some reason it might be way out, then you can of course move the axle spacers and the wheels out and the gear out a little bit to change the mesh. But I think it's a little bit fiddly, this, but I think you can just about take up small amounts of slack and get it to where you like just by adjusting those screws on the top of the pod. And as always with these things, it takes more than one go to get it right. Usually what happens is, as you screw the screws up on any car, it slightly turns the motor more, so you need to get the motor positioned and allow for the turning of the tightening of the screws. So it's a bit of guesswork until you get it just so. Now I think I've got there. It's probably still a little bit loose for my liking, but we'll give it a go and see how it runs. Can always adjust it a bit more later. I will also just pop the magnet out of here because I don't think we're going to need that. We didn't need it in the Mitsubishi, and I think this one, looking at the tyres and everything, is going to handle even better. So we'll dispense with that. The other thing I'm going to dispense with by undoing the screw on the top of the guide is the spring that's underneath it. I understand why it's there. It would be necessary if you were on a proper bumpy, decent rally track, slot track. But my Carrera track is, while not super smooth, it's fairly smooth. I've managed to get rid of most of the kind of sharp differences in the joins between the track pieces, so I don't think I need that little spring. I shall put it all back together because the 2 wires that go to the motor are, fairly sturdy. They've got a bit of spring in them. I think on my track the spring in those wires is enough. So there we are, see? That's the spring in the wires doing that, not the mechanical spring. Front axle seems fairly well set actually. I'm just going to put the car on the setup block because, as the other Avant Slot that was really brilliantly set up from the factory, I thought I'd just double check this one for you as well, rather than just assume that it is. Although it definitely is. You can see with the front wheels, they sit just inside that line and just inside that line, so the front axle is central to the chassis. And if I turn it round, just outside the line, and the other side just outside the line, so the rear axle is central to the chassis as well. So that's 2 cars from Avant Slot, and they've both been set up really very well indeed from the factory. And the front axle height is not too bad. The front wheels are touching, but only just, which is just about right. I think there's a reasonable bit of flex and float in that motor pod, but I will just take off another 1/4 to 1/3 of a turn on each of those rear screws just to give it a little bit more movement. This is just kind of based on what I've had to do to other cars of a similar design. So it's kind of a educated best guess first setup. And then, of course, a bit of oil on the rear bushings. I'm going to put a little bit of oil on the front axle, even though there's no bushings in there, just to make it run a bit smoother. And a little bit both ends of the motor. Half of the audience will now be telling me I should only do it to one end of the motor, and the other half will agree with me. So I do it to both ends of the motor. Now, the front axle is spinning nicely, but the front tyres are not sitting quite straight on the rims. So what will now happen is quite a lot of me tweaking and fiddling around the tyre so it sits nicely on the rims and spinning the axle and being quite fussy until I get them right. Okay, so quite a bit of fiddling about there, but I'm kind of happy with how the front tyres are on the front wheels, and I'm quite happy with the mesh between the motor and the rear axle. So I think it's probably time just to pop the body back on this now and take it to the track and just see how it is. So these are my very first laps with this car on this track. Starting off really quite gently just to find out how much grip there is. There is an awful lot of grip from those rear tyres, and I'm quite quickly getting the hang of this car. It seems, I don't know if saying very natural to drive is the right expression, but I can't think of a better one. It's very well suited to me. I'm already getting a hang of what the tyres are doing on the track because you can hear them a little bit. It's kind of fairly straightforward to find where the limit of adhesion is on most of the corners. The car is very easy to get into a groove with quite quickly. As you can see, I've only done a handful of laps and I'm already enjoying it. Fast forward on a few more laps and I'm noticeably quicker and really enjoying the drive of this car. As I say, this is, with a couple of minor tweaks to the pod, effectively straight out the box. And the one thing we learnt with the Mitsubishi Galant is that an Avant Slot car looks great, and it does go pretty well straight out the box as well. But it gives you, all the scope to tune it that you might want. You know, I mean, you look at this car, you've got plenty of things you can do to adjust the guide. I mean, I could probably put in a slotting plus guide. It might help a little. I think the front tyres are alright. Might try a little bit of axle adjustment. The main thing I think I'm going to do is there's not much clearance between the pod and the chassis, so I might find if I can just sand a millimetre off all the way around that pod, that'll give me a little bit more room for a little bit more float, which would be quite nice. And I'm going to play about with those body screws as well, because I think I can get a bit more float out of it than that. I think this is a fantastic car. It looks brilliant and it goes brilliant. Mr. Thumbs Up Man, he agrees too. And this is his new friend, Harry Hideface, and he's going to appear in the future on this channel, I think. More of him another time. Anyway, thanks for watching one of my videos. If you liked it, you will find a button specifically for that. Please subscribe to the channel. It is free and it really does help with the algorithm. And if you press the bell, you'll get a notification the next time I post a video. And as always, check out this Slot Car channel.